such an important point, and it's kind of a recurrent theme in a lot of the things we discuss, that the story is quite complex around these mental, psychological, and emotional processes, and even the brain mechanisms behind them. Like the amygdala is another example. You often hear about the amygdala when you're discussing fear, anxiety, and the impression would be that, oh, we should almost like get rid of the amygdala or find a way to just turn it off. But there's all sorts of positive things and important things that happen in the amygdala. Similarly, the default mode network, which is what's usually activating when we're ruminating. There's all these really important things. And so the overarching narrative is much less about good and bad in terms of all these processes, but more about the context in which they're happening and having some sense of agency about when and how they're operating in our minds. So, Richie, when I look back on my own experience meditating, and especially when I think back to the very beginning, the thing I remember most is how up in my head I was, not just when I was meditating, but really my whole life. Like at that period of my life, I was 19, I was a college student, and I would have probably won an Olympic gold medal for overthinking and rumination. And a lot of my memories of my early experience meditating was actually quite unpleasant. I remember sitting down and my mind would just be totally gone. I would sit down. Sometimes I was meditating on my breath and I would count a few breaths. I couldn't even make it to 10 and my mind would be totally distracted. Sometimes the entire meditation session. I remember times where the timer would go off after 20 minutes and I would think to myself, I just sat there and was lost in thought for 20 minutes. And the times when I wasn't lost in thought, oftentimes I was feeling bored or restless. And looking back on that, it's kind of amazing I even stuck with it because it was not at all easy for me at that time. But I think what I've learned since then, and I didn't know at the time, is how common that is. I felt like it was a personal failing, and I felt like I was just the worst meditator on the face of the planet. And there's, as you know, there's all sorts of terms for this. There's all sorts of descriptions of what this is and why it happens and how to work with it. And in some respects, the idea that it's actually a good thing to start to grapple with that and to see how your own mind is working. But even aside from meditation, I think people are just plagued by the restless energy of their own minds. So many people struggle with rumination. So many people struggle with things like getting a good night's sleep, which oftentimes is the mind is just moving so fast and people can't rest. So I thought we could discuss this and maybe cover it from two angles. Maybe in this first session, we could talk a little bit about what this is, why does it even happen to us, what do we know scientifically about overthinking and rumination. I'll share some thoughts from the point of view of Buddhist psychology. And then in a follow-up session, we'll really get into how to deal with that. What are the strategies and the methods we can use to form a more healthy relationship with this restless energy of the mind. So why don't I just kick it over to you? And I'd love just to hear any opening thoughts you might have, and then we can get into the science of what is actually going on here.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you, Cord. And this is really a great and juicy topic. Uh, we really, I think, can begin by asking ourselves in a sort of casual way what rumination is and why we humans seem to do it a lot. And What rumination is the ability to, if you will, disengage from what is immediately in front of us in our environment and reflect on our past or project into the future. And there's a term that psychologists have used for this called mental time travel, our ability to um, consider events that had occurred in the past or that will occur in the future. And when we reflect on the human capability for mental time travel, there are obvious advantages to that. Um, if something occurred in the past that was in some way beneficial, we can reflect on it and figure out maybe how to do that more often. If something in the past was deleterious, caused some anxiety or upset, we can reflect on how we might plan our lives in a way that would minimize that occurring in the future. So, having an ability to reflect on events in the past will obviously be an important foundation for us in planning for the future. And with regard to the future, we really are unique among species in being able to project into the future, to imagine what a future might be if we choose one path versus another path, for example. And it could be for anything. It could be for simple decisions or more complex decisions. I mean, imagine just sitting at a restaurant where or actually before we go out to dinner, reflecting on what you may order
Yeah, you're
with
like
the
imagining the whole scenario where you're going to go, what you might eat, how might obviously you want to do that because you'll enjoy it and you're going to have fun and you sort of play out the whole thing before just to make that little decision.
Exactly. And how many of you, given the kind of readily available information on the internet, look up a menu in a restaurant before you actually go out to that restaurant? A restaurant maybe that you haven't been to before. I know I do that, and I'm sure many people do that. And again, it's engages this apparatus that we have, and of course, for more important decisions, we really harness that capacity. If we have major events that we're anticipating, whether to take this job or another job, whether to move to another location, whether to buy a particular house or not, to marry a particular person or not, those are really complex decisions that call upon this capacity. And in terms of neuroscience, there's a chunk of real estate in the front of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. And if you look at the ratio of the prefrontal cortex to the remaining cortical tissue, that ratio is larger in humans than it is in any other species. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that our capacity to ruminate is really very importantly dependent on this prefrontal cortex. So, this is the part of the brain that allows us to retrieve memories from the past, to project into the future, and also to integrate that information.
It sounds so nice the way you describe it, like, oh, like how wonderful that we can imagine these great things and plan, and we can think back on all the wonderful things that have happened in our lives and reminisce about these great memories. The reality is that for a lot of us, that thinking mind is kind of a toxic cesspool of actually the not so nice part of that. In theory, we could be spending a lot of time planning for the future in a very thoughtful, inspiring, uplifting way and remembering positive things that also uplift us. But a lot of times we're thinking about the past in a way that's really negative. We think about all the things went wrong, we should have done differently, or we're just stuck on some old painful memory. Or like if I think about my own experience, especially in those early days of meditating where I was so anxious, I was constantly projecting into the future, but it was not a nice experience. I mean, I was thinking about all the things that could go wrong. I was thinking about the things that were stressful, that were kind of stressing me out. Like I like to give as the example public speaking because I do it so much now. It's kind of a huge irony of my life. But I would think about that stuff, and it was so painful. Like I would just be stuck in loops of thinking that were deeply unpleasant, and yet I felt almost powerless to stop it at the time. And I think that is how many people feel. So that's a really interesting thing because clearly it can have a positive impact. It gives us this ability to plan or to remember positive things. But oftentimes we're actually not remembering positive things. It seems like there's generally a bias towards the negative in our thinking. And why would that even be the case? It seems the opposite of what would be adaptive and healthy.
Yeah, so those are all great questions. And with regard to a bias toward the negative, of course, there are evolutionary reasons why we might detect threats that may be important to us. And one of the important considerations is that the threat biology in our bodies, the capacity to mobilize our muscles to run or to fight in the classic fight or flight response that may entail an elevation in heart rate, an activation of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which increases blood flow to the peripheral muscles. Um, uh, all and increases respiration rate, those kinds of autonomic changes. In our evolutionary past, those historically were important in helping us adapt to situations of threat. And many people have made this point. In the modern era, the threats to us are much more likely to be psychological threats or threats that at least are not physical threats. And yet, we're wired to mobilize that same circuitry. And so we may have a worry about the future. And what it does is it hijacks our stress biology. It activates the sympathetic nervous system. There are stress hormones that could be released. All of that may be engaged by simply worrying about some event that may be occurring in the future. And anxiety is very much a future oriented kind of issue. Anxiety often arises when we are reflecting on the future, when we're worrying about the future. And this is one of the ruminative kinds of loops that we can get caught in. The other thing to appreciate is that we humans have brains that are contrast detectors. The brain is much more likely to notice if something is different, if something is not aligned with our expectations about how things normally should be. And negative things in general for most people are actually less frequent than positive things. And so we tend to notice the negative stuff more. We tend to pay more attention to it because it is less frequent.
Hmm.
Um, and so when we, hear the refrain, which I think many people experience, that their rumination or worrying about the future or reflection about the past is more about negative things. It might be more about negative things, but one thing we can say for sure is that the negative things hijack our attention more.
Hmm.
It may be that there's positive things going on too. We're just much less likely to notice them. They may sort of just be in the background and not garner our attention because they're actually much more common.
Yeah, I always think of as an example of this as just driving through traffic. If you drive to work, you can say you drive for 20 minutes, and if there's a car accident or something out of the ordinary, or somebody cuts you off, what you'll remember is that one thing, that one negative thing. What you won't remember is seamless social harmony. And traffic is actually kind of an amazing thing, especially if you're on the highway. If you really reflect on it, all these
Or
people,
in a
hundreds
place
of
like
people.
India, where we both have been.
Yeah, exactly. You notice you definitely notice when it's not there, and the seamless.
Although the fact that there aren't more accidents in places like that does also underscore
Yeah, that's
the
true.
the social harmony
But there's so
that
many
does
examples like
exist.
that where you don't notice all these amazing positive things just because it's the baseline, it's the normal thing, and you just kind of tune it out. But you'll remember that one negative thing. What you just mentioned, going back to the earlier point around our evolutionary past, that was really helpful for me to understand my own mind and kind of the anxious predisposition that I've had personally and have talked about, heard from so many other people about as well. Because I thought about it and I was thinking, why would this ever be a good thing? And I could see that if the reality you live in really is around physical threats, say, for example, if you go way back in our ancient past and you're out foraging in the forest or you're doing something where physical threats, unfortunately, this is still the reality for some people. But as you said, for most people or a lot of people, it's not physical threats. You're not at risk of sacrificing your physical safety on a regular basis. But if you were, and say you were out doing something and there was something, maybe you had dangerous animals in the area or there was some other physical danger, lying in bed at night and thinking about that is almost like a preparatory mechanism. And you can imagine, why would the people who did that survive and the people who didn't? Like, why would evolution select for that happening? Is because if you imagine like the two of us, we're in our, our cave or something or whatever, and we're going to bed and one of us is thinking over and over again about the dangerous animals or whatever those threats might be, and you're replaying that in your mind. And of course, that would feel horrible. But the next day, who is going to be better prepared to be anticipating that? You're going to be hyper vigilant. And again, being hyper vigilant also is not a very pleasant experience. But it probably helped people survive in those circumstances where they needed to be aware, hyper aware of their environment. And as you said, the key is that now we have this system where we are incredibly good at detecting threats and incredibly bad at discerning which threats are emotional or psychological and which threats are physical. So we've got this biology that works great in a certain set of circumstances, but increasingly those are not the circumstances we actually live in. Meditation, and we'll get into this in the next segment, one of the things it does is that I feel like it helps us fine-tune that threat response, where you don't want to take it offline because there are times when you definitely need that fight or flight or freeze response. You wouldn't want to delete that from your response, but we do need to be able to reflect, when are we in this toxic loop where we're just doom scrolling and that threat response is coming online, or somebody said something to us at work that, triggered us and we're still thinking about it a day later, a week later, and whatnot. So I'm kind of curious, given the reality that this is where a
Yeah.
lot of us live and we've somehow created a world that is triggering this threat response, this biological response over and over again, how prevalent is it and what are the toxic side effects of that? Because I know there's a lot of interesting research on just all the many ways this affects us.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll say a few things about that, and then there's another issue related to this that is important to also highlight. So, regarding the toxicity of this kind of response, when these changes are elicited acutely. So, for example, if we're in a situation where our physical needs are somehow at risk and we're physically at risk and potentially in a harmful situation, the acute changes that are mobilized can be very helpful and help us escape or somehow get out of that situation. um, when those acute changes become more and more chronic, so imagine a person who's constantly worrying about the future and worrying uh, about events that may not entail any physical harm, and yet those events are hijacking the stress biology. When those changes transition from being acute to more chronic, that's when they really can exact a toll. So, a phasic increase, a momentary increase in our heart rate, or the release of stress hormones in an acute situation is very appropriate and can be very healthy. But when that is sustained over time, that's when it really becomes problematic.
And on that point,
We
just to interject really quickly, that was another interesting point. We actually discussed this in our an episode on the science of uncertainty. But that's another thing that came up in that conversation that's very relevant to this. When you do have that kind of physical threat and it's appropriate, usually that action serves to almost dissipate the energy that builds up. Like you actually do need to fight, you do need to flee or you freeze. And somehow taking that action does it almost, it's like a release of that energy. But we often now have these situations where there's nothing to fight. Like you're doom scrolling or something happens at work and you're ruminating that night as you're trying to go to sleep. What are you going to do? There's no action to take and you're just stuck with
Yeah,
this response and there's nowhere to go with it. The energy just gets stuck in the system almost.
right, and it's precisely in those situations where the acute change becomes more chronic. The elevation, for example, in the stress hormone cortisol becomes more chronic over time, and we know that when cortisol is elevated in a chronic way, it really can be deleterious. And so it's not like cortisol is a bad hormone. None of us would want to get rid of the stress hormone cortisol. It's critical for our survival. And there's a diurnal rhythm to cortisol. In the morning, it's high, and over the course of the day, it gets progressively lower. But if we are under chronic stress, if we're ruminating constantly, what has been found is that our cortisol remains elevated. It doesn't show this normal diurnal variation. And when the cortisol tends to be high in the evening, that's when it really can produce all kinds of problems and it can interfere with our sleep. There are deleterious effects that it can produce in the brain itself. So I wanted to just mention one other point uh, about uh, about this, which is about some of the beneficial um, uh, uh, consequences of this ability for mental time travel and our ability to project into the future. And I just want to inject it as an important point. We will come back to it either later in this podcast or another time. But as many of you know, Cort and I have developed this template or framework for understanding the key pillars of well-being. And there are four pillars: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And purpose is really about finding our true north, pursuing our goals and values. And that depends on our ability to anticipate the future. And so we really couldn't develop a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, without the capacity for mental time travel. Really, in part, it's the capacity, and we'll talk more about this at some point. It's the capacity to envision perhaps a different mode of being. And that capacity is really important in producing human flourishing. And so this really underscores a really important point, and that is that the very same mechanisms in our brain and body that are often hijacked and can cause suffering, we can harness those same mechanisms for flourishing.
Such an important point, and it's kind of a recurrent theme in a lot of the things we discuss, that the story is quite complex around these mental, psychological, and emotional processes, and even the brain mechanisms behind them. Like the amygdala is another example. You often hear about the amygdala when you're discussing fear, anxiety, and the impression would be that, oh, we should almost like get rid of the amygdala or find a way to just turn it off. But there's all sorts of positive things and important things that happen in the amygdala. Similarly, the default mode network, which is what's usually activating when we're ruminating. There's all these really important things. And so the overarching narrative is much less about good and bad in terms of all these processes, but more about the context in which they're happening and having some sense of agency about when and how they're operating in our minds. In some respects, that's essentially what meditation is doing. It's putting us in the driver's seat. It's giving us the perspective to step back and investigate. Is this healthy? Is this an adaptive response? Or is this something that perhaps isn't right for this particular context? So that's a good segue into the contemplative perspective, and will also feed into our next discussion, which is, what do we do about this? What can we do about this? But from the point of view of Buddhist psychology, a lot of the perspective is based on the idea that a lot of our suffering, in particular the mental and emotional suffering that we experience, is fundamentally due to not seeing things clearly. This narrowing of perspective, and oftentimes this distorted way of thinking, takes root in our mind and becomes almost habitual and automatic. And so a lot of what we're doing in meditation, certainly from the point of view of Buddhist psychology, is first learning to step back and just examine what's happening. And from that vantage point, then you can start asking some questions, not to form a belief system about things, but rather to directly observe your own mind as it's functioning in real time. And then you can just say, you could take an insight like you shared earlier. You can take a moment of reactivity where you're feeling stressed out or where you're ruminating, and you can just discern, my nervous system is behaving as though there's a physical threat right now. I'm having that fight or flight response. But is there actually something to fight or to flee from? And usually the answer is no to that. Just having that ability to step back and in the space to investigate is kind of a game changer. I mean, it's not kind of a game changer. It is a game changer. It totally shifts the trajectory. It puts us back in the driver's seat so we can work with these things in a healthy way. But it's all based on actually the very things you were talking about earlier with our model of, or our framework of well-being and flourishing. You need awareness. You need that ability to see it clearly. And then you need the capacity to get curious, not to judge it as good or bad, but really to get curious and explore it. And then that opens up all sorts of other opportunities as well. So any final thoughts? We're going to have another discussion in our next segment about the what to do about it. And there's some really cool, interesting things that give us tools to work with this. But any final thoughts as we close this one up?
Yeah, well, I think that just to sort of preview the next chapter on this, and that is one way to think about our capacity to harness these parts of our mind and our brain really has to do with with fluidity, the capacity to transition um, with voluntary control, if you will, from one mode to another, and do it in a way which is appropriate to the context. And that's really the kind of skill that the contemplative traditions afford us when we practice those methods.
Yeah, that point, it's a great point to end on, because a lot of our lives, I don't think we don't think about it this way, but when we're overthinking, when we're ruminating, oftentimes it is exactly our minds and brains not doing that. We were in one context, and suddenly we find ourselves in a different context, but our nervous system is acting like we're in some other context than the one we're actually in. If you just take an obvious example, you get stressed out at work, maybe something bad happens, or you're worried something bad might happen, and then you're in bed, but your mind is acting as though you're in this threatening, challenging, stressful situation at work. But you're not at work. You're in bed. You're trying to get some sleep. And it's almost like your mind has not had that, or it's lost that ability to just acknowledge and adapt to the context that's actually happening. We're recreating or projecting into some context that might never happen, or certainly has not happened yet. So it's almost like the inability to sort of discern the context and to adjust to that context is kind of where the failure comes in. And again, 1,000 years ago, that might have been very healthy to keep us alive, but it clearly is not healthy in keeping us well adjusted and balanced in this current modern world. So maybe we can pause here, and we're going to have what will be a very interesting discussion about the different strategies. And we're going to talk about 3 specific strategies for how we deal with the restless energy of the mind. So hopefully we will see you on our next session of Dharma Lab. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.